Hello, everybody. A warm welcome in the Goethe-Institut once again. That's the start of our fall season, and we're delighted to have a wonderful, interesting program tonight. My name is Jörg Süßenbach. I'm the director of the Goethe-Institut. Tonight's conversation with the title, The Biggest Story of Our Time, Climate Activism and the Election, is the last part of a podcast series called Foreign Correspondent, which is a partnership with the American Council on Germany. This transatlantic dialogue highlights how German and American journalists and experts see political and social developments in their countries and around the world. If you're interested, you can listen to the other 6 podcasts online. Just put in Foreign Correspondent. There are a lot of interesting topics going on with that. We're very pleased to welcome 2 very well-known experts on this topic tonight, Luisa Neubauer and Bill McKibben. Thank you so much for being with us. And we're very delighted that we have Sabrina Schenkman with us as a moderator today. She's, maybe you know her, a reporter of the Boston Globe, and she's very deep into these topics, environment, climate change, and all the things we're going to talk about tonight. She will introduce our both panelists a little bit later, so you know more about them. The conversation will last around 45 minutes. And afterwards, you have the possibility to make comments or ask questions. We just want to say it would be good if you use this microphone because we want to have that on the podcast as well. So don't be frightened, but use the microphone. After the event, we want to invite you for a little reception in the back room so we can have another glass of wine or beer and talk a little bit about what we experienced tonight. Well, that's the moment to thank our panelists, our moderator, our cooperation partner, the ACG, for the collaboration, the whole Goethe team who makes this show possible tonight, and especially we want to thank Sabine von Mehring. Where is she? Over there. She's so instrumental, I think, for the whole stay of Luisa in the US. And she helped us so much to put this night together. Thank you so much, Sabine, for being with us all the years and helping us to make this happen tonight. And finally, I want to mention, if you want to experience Luisa for a second time this week, you can come on Thursday, Sabine told me, to the Suffolk University's Fort Hall Forum. Am I right? You can sign for that on the WGBH Forum website. So that's a moment to pass over to Sabrina. Thank you again for coming, and let's see what this night brings.
All right. Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for the 7th edition of Foreign Correspondent Unplugged. The American Council on Germany and the Goethe-Institut have partnered for this series of in-person events in cities across the country. My name is Sabrina Schenkman, and I report on climate change at the Boston Globe. I am delighted to be moderating today's conversation. From sea level rise, melting glaciers, and extreme heat waves to the transition to renewables, climate change affects everyone. It is the biggest story of our time. How are climate activists in both the US and in Germany addressing the topic? What is at stake, and how could the US election impact the future of fossil fuels? Is there more awareness of climate change in Germany than in the US? In this conversation, I'm joined by 2 experts who will explore these questions and more. To my left is Luisa Neubauer, who is a German climate activist and author and was recently named as one of Time's Next 100 Rising Stars. She is one of the primary organizers behind Fridays for Future in Germany, where she has helped mobilize 1.4 million youth and has spoken openly about her beliefs that the politicians and media are ignoring the climate crisis. Thanks for being here, Luisa. And then to my right, we have Bill McKibben, a contributing writer to The New Yorker, an educator, environmentalist, and founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. He founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. Thanks for being here, Bill. All right. Well, to start it off, I think we should level set a little bit, because we're going to be doing a lot of comparing between what's happening in Germany and what's happening in the United States. You know, obviously we have a very heated election season going on in the US. That is also the case in Germany. So I wondered if we could maybe set the table with where are we in the election season in Germany, and how is climate factoring in? We're going to get into a lot of the details as we go further into this discussion, so don't feel like you have to explain the whole thing, but give us a little bit of a taste of where things stand.
Yes, of course. So thank you so much for having us here tonight. In Germany, we are 1 year ahead of our next national elections. But if you had pre-elections in a country like ours, we don't have them officially, but unofficially we do have something like pre-elections right now, which are crucial province elections in 3 of the 16 states of Germany. All of them are in East Germany, which is crucial to know because between East Germany and West Germany, we still have huge political divides 34 years after the wall was ripped down. We see that an election cycle in Germany is technically much shorter than the one in the US. So we wouldn't have candidates yet. We wouldn't, there's some rumors going on. Someone saying, I'm not going to run, and someone said I would be open. But these things don't start until later the year. However, the very mood, the energy, the vibe under which we're going to be operating during the election season, that is very much being set now. And we see that in contrast to our last national election, where climate was among the top 3 voter issues, we're seeing now that it's going to be much harder to mainstream climate ideas. And yet I would say, especially in contrast to what we're seeing in the US right now, we did do a good job, in my understanding, in the past years to mainstream climate across all parties. It's not enough still, and we're still working so hard, but we will know that no Democratic Party would openly oppose climate action as such during an election campaign. And we had this beautiful moment just the other day. It was a public battle on former Twitter of different prime ministers of the states battling each other against who is more investing in clean energy, who is further ahead on solar, both being conservative ministers. So it was really interesting to see that we saw on the conservative end people really bragging about the development of clean energy technologies, of EVs in the country, and we see that very necessary and productive competition arising across all democratic parties. We, of course, have a right extremist problem, which is rising, which is getting more severe, and that is, of course, a party that is smashing climate ideals. And yet, in a very twisted way, we see the rise of right extremism in Germany also creating this new divide on the climate end. So we see democratic parties experiencing an even greater need to express their support for climate action in opposition to the right extremist. Because we see that, what we call Brandmauer, the wall between the Democrats and the anti-Democrats isn't just a wall of democracy, it's also a wall of ecology. And we're really working hard to mainstream that idea. Yeah,
that's really interesting. All right, Bill, same to you. I mean, where do we stand? How much is climate factoring in what's going on and in the conversation broadly right now?
Well, first of all, what a pleasure to be here. Y'all read Sabrina's stories, I hope, but there really are some of the great climate reporting that's going on. And we're in a moment of actually very good climate reporting across American journalism, but some of the best coming out of the globe, and thank you for it.
Thank you very much.
And also, what an extraordinary pleasure to get to welcome Louisa to America. Though she's young, we're old friends who've known each other for a very long time, and her work has been absolutely critical. There's no more important climate leader on the continent than she, and she's been an amazing organizer, writer, thinker, speaker in many forums, including electoral politics. Look, I mean, you all know that climate change is not the dominant issue in our election, even though we've come through the 2 hottest years in the last 125,000 years on this planet. And you all know the reasons for that. I mean, the main issue in our election is that we have a repulsive lunatic seeking return to the White House, and it's an all-out effort to somehow prevent that from happening. And the other reason is that we didn't have primaries, and primaries are the place in the American political system where we're able to take issues off the table and insert them into the conversation. In the 2020 primaries, that was a crucial, we sort of forget because it was right before the pandemic, but that's what happened. Climate became the #1 voting issue in many polls for Democrats in those primaries. In order to mollify the Bernie wing of the party, Biden had to adopt a very strong climate platform, and to his great credit, he fulfilled that set of promises. He spent all his political capital getting us the IRA, imperfect but powerful piece of legislation. And that also means, I think, that the kind of capacity for big federal legislation around climate is gone for a while. The way that our political system works, it's like it takes a long time to build up the head of steam necessary to somehow get things through our super polarized, dysfunctional political system. And I don't think we're going to see. In climate terms, despite the fact that they're not talking about it, despite the fact that Kamala Harris is, for the sake of Pennsylvania, backing away from, the choice obviously couldn't be starker. Donald Trump is 100% captured, and proudly so, by the fossil fuel industry. You'll recall that moment a couple of months ago when there were tapes of him promising the oil executives at a fundraising thing in a kind of Austin Powers moment that for $1 billion he would do anything that they wanted him to. They actually don't even need to pay him the $1 billion, but they're raising money as fast as they can because they recognize that he is their last hope at slowing the momentum towards clean energy that's finally beginning to gather. The reason that this election becomes so important, of course, is that climate change is a timed test. The IPCC has told us that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 to have some hope of staying on a Paris pathway. The next president will be inaugurated on January of 2029, with 11 months before that deadline. So this is the last election that probably makes a huge difference in a physically relevant time frame. So that's why it's fun to be in Boston for the night, and Louisa was enough to, prospect of seeing her was enough to lure me here, but this is the only step I've taken onto safe blue territory for weeks, and I'm in the swing states from now till November 5th, doing what we can to rally people to action.
Bit of applause over there for that. So, one of the things that I find so interesting in the parallels between Germany and the United States is that Germany was way ahead of the US when it came to adopting clean energy and innovating and kind of turning clean energy into something that everyone was taking part in. Now, many years later, we're seeing this rise in the far-right party. Now, as you were just talking about, we had the first real climate president, in some ways, in Joe Biden, who incorporated the activism of the youth from the Sunrise Movement, and it resulted in some big legislation. There is obviously a lot of backlash, a big cultural moment around the idea of a Green New Deal, which is, like the third rail now when it comes to conservatives and their talking points. They just love to hammer on that. So I'm just curious, to what extent, Louisa, do you think that the backlash and the rise of the far right might be related at all to some of the the earlier efforts, the rise of the Green Party, the success of the clean energy movement, and also maybe some of the challenges that came from it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in the past 5 years, we saw some of the most progressive, radical, green politics emerging from a conservative commission head of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen. So we saw that, during the last 5 years, we did see very conservative forces across the European continent, but also within Germany, to really emerge around the question of environmentalism. We saw a Bavarian prime minister very prominently hugging that tree back then when we were on the streets, and that, very awkward moment of time. But, we really saw that there was some pride emerging around, conserving our Heimat, our homes, about this whole Christianity thing, which our conservatives are obviously, of course, quite tied to. And we did see that for a while, I would say, somehow we had, because movement erupted so swiftly, we weren't on the agenda of the right extremists for a surprising long amount of time. We also did see that some of the most important pieces of the Energiewende, of the German energy transition, emerged under Merkel. And it was also a Merkel government that then destructed a lot of that things, but that's a different chapter in the story. But we did see that for a long time, climate wasn't as divisive of an issue between the different parties as it is today. And what we see, and I think that's why in Germany so many things are a bit twisted, we see that what we now, the extremist rise on the right now, is that very toxic mix of hatred against this whole Merkel immigration situation from 2015, a conservative woman deciding to keep the borders open because there was one time in history, it was after the Second World War, they had closed the borders and German refugees couldn't get back into the country. And it was by that time that people and politics made laws to keep those borders open, because that should never happen again for all the good reasons. So when in 2015 Merkel decided to stick to that value, then later on we would see a pandemic fueling a sentiment of state oppression, and then later on a Russian invasion into the Ukraine, fueling this hatred against everything that is out there. I think that was when this kind of toxic mix of right extremist sentiments came together with a whole backlash on German, especially heating laws. But it wasn't, and I find it important to distinct here, it wasn't the core of a right-wing ideology in Germany to hate everything on the climate end. It was rather something that kind of emerged later on, with the Greens rising into the government, with some proper hatred fueled against a Green Minister of Economy. And why does it matter? It means that there isn't a core identity on the right that is by law against climate. There is a lot of conservative and even right-wing politics that we can really work with, and that we have worked with in the past, and that hold some of the biggest successes of climate history in Germany. Thinking of some very important environmental ministers of the country that were crucially coming from the Conservative Party, enabling a lot of mainstream understanding of environmentalism. And now we see that something is flipping over. There's this new hatred against immigrants, women, and climate, everything that you can oppress, but it's not by law. And this idea, I think there is a very, and I would say, problematic story that is sometimes being told by conservative, especially conservative, but even by our chancellor now, about climate action overwhelming the people. So there is a very German story of people who are feeling politics is overwhelming them, the circumstances are so tough. That are the people who will at the next point in time vote for the fascist. This whole 1930 backlash coming back, people feeling like, oh no, the economy is breaking down, people are losing their jobs, and next thing we have is fascism against. And so there is this German sentiment of people who feel overwhelmed by crisis are going to take down our democracy, which is why I remember vividly those conversations I had with Angela Merkel back then when she was still in office, of her as a very, educated and very, friendly and open-minded woman explaining to me, we can't do what you want because people will take down our democracy. And I find that very highly inaccurate when we look around, because we do find people are overwhelmed and people feel like it's too much. But what is too much when we look closely, like beyond the propaganda and the fairy tales that are being told, when we look closely, what is overwhelming people, what is the additional burden on people, it's usually crises. It's usually unsolved crises, may it be economic crisis, inflation crisis, societal crisis, democracy crisis, or nature, climate crisis. It is crisis that is putting too much on people's lives everywhere for all, and we need to protect people from that. I just don't find it promising at all to come up with a solution that contains ignoring what might be the most painful, the most hurtful, the most destructive crisis that we have, which is a climate crisis. And to paint this picture, to tell this fairy tale of us being able to choose between nothing will change and we do some climate action, that is just not the world we live in. We can choose between climate action and climate crisis. That is the options that we have, at best. And so I find there is some self-serving idea in politics about climate action fueling extremism, but we see that if you do it in a just and equal way, it is one of the best tools that we have to actually preserve societies and protect democracies.
But it is interesting to think about it not being a core characteristic of... It's interesting to think about it not being a core characteristic of the extreme right, which I want to throw over to you. I mean, how would you contrast that to here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a big backlash against climate action at all. The polling continues to show big majorities. The issue on which Trump is least aligned with the American public is the widest gap between what people think and what Trump thinks is over climate action. Big majorities, even among Republicans, for action on clean energy in this country. That's never really been the problem. And look, I mean, to some degree, even Kamala understands that even in the moment. You saw her making fun of Trump for linking windmills to cancer in the debate. He wins nobody with those, with that stuff. The problem is what it's always been, which is the extraordinary financial and hence political power of the fossil fuel industry and its ability to intimidate and to dominate campaigns, to just throw huge amounts of money at things. And the other just contingent thing that's happening here is because of this strange way that our election has, the primary and everything else went. We basically are emerging with an election in which Pennsylvania will decide the presidency, and it just happens that fracking is a kind of live issue in Pennsylvania. Again, not an overwhelming, it's not like people in Pennsylvania are overwhelmingly in love with fracking. They're not, but they're worried that the tiny sliver of swing voters that they have to win this is what happens in our bizarre political architecture. The reason that we have spent $1 zillion promoting the completely useless and stupid technology of ethanol has entirely to do with the fact that for 3 decades, the Iowa caucuses were the first thing that happened in the American political season. There is no other reason than that. So a lot of what's happening is sort of just almost accidental. I do think you'll see lots more effort over the next 6 weeks from the Harris people to talk about the incredible resurgence of manufacturing jobs across the middle of the country that's entirely due to the IRA and clean energy manufacturing. They haven't made enough of it yet. I think they will more as things go on. And I think that in many ways, including this one, if we make it through this election, then things change in profound ways going forward. Given another 4 years for the kind of IRA stuff to play out, for people to see that this transition is actually to cheaper energy, that it's, you know, on and on and on, then the politics of this shift dramatically. That's why the oil industry is so scared. They look at what has happened, say, this year in California. California really did, over the last 3 or 4 years, do the work to put up a lot of solar panels and a lot of batteries. California, for the last 100 days, has produced more than 100% of the electricity that it needs for long stretches each day, entirely from renewable energy. When the sun goes down at night, batteries are the biggest source of supply to the grid. I just did a piece for the New Yorker pointing out that California this year is using 29% less gas to produce electricity than last year. So there's been a 29% drop in the use of gas in the fifth largest economy in the world in 1 year. Those are the numbers that terrify the fossil fuel industry. That's what's coming for them. Their only instinct is to try and delay that, which they will be able to do to one degree or another with a Trump presidency. And of course, they'll delay it right at the moment when the planet's physical systems are breaking down from an excess of carbon in the atmosphere. So getting through this election is utterly crucial, but it's not, as I think Louisa is very correct, it's not a backlash about climate. It's a backlash about black and brown people and women that you know, is what's powering the conservative force in this country. And you know, I have not confidence, but I'm committed to the idea for my own sanity that we're actually going to pull this election out. I think it'll be close, but I think that there's a bare majority of good people in this country enough to make it happen. But that said, since Massachusetts is 100% entirely safe, figure out how to help. I saw the sign-up sheet for Third Act out there. We've got, maybe someone should pass it around here, because I believe, just my sense is, there's 3 or 4 people in the audience who meet our 60-plus age criteria. We're writing 200,000 postcards a week into the swing states. We've got busloads of people descending on Pennsylvania and whatever, because it turns out that Americans will still open the door if there's a 75-year-old lady on the other side of it, you know, on and on. So if you care about the climate or the democracy that we've been privileged to inhabit, the next 7 weeks are, that's it, man. That's it.
Well, you just gave us a little glimpse into what climate activism looks like right now during this election. Louisa, can you talk about, like, what is the face of climate activism in Germany as it pertains to, you know, the political landscape there right now? Like, what does it look like? How is it bringing people in, or what kind of form can it take?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's changed a lot. I'm not sure how many people here in the audience are familiar with the kind of movement landscape in Germany, but when we set up Fridays for Future in Germany, which is today, I reckon, still the largest climate movement that there is in the country, we set up something we call For Future Family. So there was Fridays for Future, which is for young people, you know, to join, but there's also Parents for Future, and there's Grandparents for Future. And then psychologists came together and said, oh, the young people have climate anxiety. And they started Psychologists for Future to give free, you know, counseling hours to people in despair. And then the architects came together to say, hey, by the way, we need some experts figuring out how to get the building stuff done. So they had Architects for Future, which are today some of the strongest lobbies in Germany to stop this freakish idea that we can build ourselves out of the climate crisis. We probably won't, and someone will have to, you know, start protecting what there is in terms of infrastructure. We have something, I don't even know what you call those guys in the US, the Schornsteinfeger, what are the chimney sweepers. We have the chimney sweepers for future who called me up and said, Louisa, you know, with this whole chimney sweeping business, I think we're gonna have an issue if that stuff happens what you want. And I was like, I'm so sorry, man, you know. And they said, well, look, with the chimney sweeping, it's that people actually trust the chimney sweepers big times. Because there's a law in Germany, and if you burn something, you will have to get a chimney sweeper around who takes care that everything is safe. You know that by law you have to get them in. So all they sell to you is security. So homeowners in Germany, who are a very particular bunch of people that we need to win for the heat pumps, and you know who are big contested in the country, the chimney sweepers thought if we go around and we talk to the people about insulation, about heat pumps, about how to solar and everything on your roof, they might listen to us in a way they wouldn't listen to politics because they trust us so much. So aren't we the next housing energy expert that should go around and do the security work in terms of the future? So they set up chimney sweepers for future to go around, and they are now a big expert in the country in heat pumps, and they will now have lots of questions. They call me up a lot about the heat pump business, which is also a different new field. But so what we did is we tried to find in every angle of society the farmers for future, the yoga for future people, which are quite essential, we found out. But there is bakers for future who would go around on climate protests and hand out bakery stuff. And of course, the baking business is big in the country, so they're very dear to us. There is now, which I find very important, comedy for future. So some big celebrity comedians saying, we are difficult with humor in Germany, but we got to work on that end in terms of climate as well. And the best fun about vegans, the biggest jokes about vegans, should come from vegans, right? So we need to own that one as well. And so there is that very lively, I would say, environment, and some of that is quite hidden. So you wouldn't probably even know about it. That there is, what I love, of course, is churches for future. So all the churches coming up and say, we do the services on climate, and we get people together and provide a space for people to mourn and to love and to whatever they do. And we try to create this ecosystem that isn't one voice, but that is, happening on every single, layer that you can imagine on this whole spectrum. And I find that has been throughout the last 5 years some of the most sustainable infrastructure, because it isn't bound to that one voice or one face that sometimes provide. It's not bound to one single political party or one generation. We really try to make sure people find in every corner of their lives, they would find one very easy entrance to an environmental space. Whether you're a working mom or you're a granddad or you just got into school, somewhere there will be someone who has some story to tell. Which I find was, looking back, we didn't think about it in that way, but looking back I find it was maybe the most reasonable answer we could give in a time where I was still challenged on every single plastic bottle and on every piece of tofu, and where there was an image being painted about climate activism happening exclusively in that moment that you write your shopping list or you decide to cycle and tofu and whatever you do. And we wanted to break that and create a new image of activism being quiet sometimes and very outspoken on the other side. That's fun and that's serious, and it's all these things that life is, because eventually it's about the world and it should be about every single part of that. Long story short, that was fun. And then, of course, with the pandemic and the Ukraine, the Russian invasion and the right extremism in Germany, we as a movement, because we were so successful in a way in organizing in all parts of the country and in all generations, paradoxically, as a climate movement, we found ourselves in the position to suddenly be called in for every other issue that there could be. So we organized, in the beginning of this year, we organized some of the largest democracy demonstrations that we've seen in the country, fueled by this term remigration that the far right used, which I shockingly found out today Donald Trump is proudly using about his plans after being elected. which I find so deeply worrying. We protested against the Russian invasion. We were doing this helpline things around the pandemic, and we found that as we see the world shaking in so many ends, movements are needed, and people who can organize and people who can bring people together organized. And I now feel a climate movement alone won't be able to solve all those different things, and we're trying very hard. But I would say for what's ahead, we need strong climate movements who talk climate, who organize around climate, and we need people who take that idea and bring it to all the different kind of fires that we have to build strong infrastructures around democracy, build strong infrastructure about peace, build strong infrastructure about community care and all these things that we need. So I hope that in the next phase of the climate movement, we see people not to call up the climate movement to say, can you fix this? But maybe call us up and say, can you show us how to do it? So we can go and do it. Which I would think would be some of the most wonderful, developments of what is about. And I would say it could be quite a promising response to a world in so many crises.
It's really interesting. So one thing I think about a lot is who activists are protesting, what they're protesting, and to whom. I've spoken with some activists here in the Boston area who focus specifically on targets on the left because they feel that they might be more movable, because they feel that on the right there is not a whole lot of hope, not with individuals who are Republican voters. There's plenty of hope there, they say, but with the politicians that there's less hope. And so they focus in on those on the left who could be doing better. So they're the people who are showing up, trying to get Maura Healey, our governor here, to commit to no more fossil fuel infrastructure. They're showing up at any kind of independent or center-leaning left candidate to try to push them further to make pronouncements about climate change. And I'm curious, Bill, maybe you want to weigh in on, who the target should be for activists. Not that there's one right answer, but where do you focus your energy?
I think the most important focus is always on the deep connections to the problem. We've helped run this summer-long campaign in New York City that sent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to jail week after week outside Citibank headquarters, the single biggest funder of the fossil industry. There are times when you have to pressure politicians, but I think it's smart to try to do it in ways that, I was telling Louisa, I sort of helped lead the organizing for the first big set of climate kind of demonstrations in this country, Keystone Pipeline in September of 2011, which of course was in the first Obama term. And we liked Obama. I'd worked hard to get him elected. So when we went down to protest him, when we went down to demand action on Keystone and surround the White House, we were all wearing our Obama buttons. And we were saying, we're doing this because we know he wants to do the right thing. We're opening up space for him to do it, and so on. I think that sometimes out of frustration, movements start doing things that aren't tactically brilliant. I think the sort of best example was, in recent times was people deciding that, spray painting Stonehenge might, attract people to it seems unlikely to me, because Stonehenge is unconnected to the fossil fuel system that, literally a artifact of the time long before we we're doing anything like this. So I think that I usually end up spending most of the times I've been to jail, it's been, has some.
Just wanted to note that.
Maybe on a political side, obviously we have the fossil fuel industry. I think there might be like a rule of thumb that actually works on this end, because as maybe some of you in the audience, maybe someone who has Googled me will find out that in Germany I'm quite controversial at some time, like for some people. I don't know exactly why, but apparently there is a lot of, I would say, there is some weird corner that can't deal with, I would say, to be very honest, a young woman having an opinion publicly, but I don't know, whatever. And so there is, in some comment sections you would find an enormous amount of grievances coming exclusively from men, to be very honest. And it's sometimes difficult to navigate as a public activist between hate and criticism. You know, there's some hate in the room, people who are just like obsessed with my existence, and I really wish they would find some like hobbies or so on. You know, the time you could save.
That is their hobby, yes.
And man, like it's a Friday afternoon, you know, and you hang out on these Facebook comment sections. I'm like, go out, you know, go for a walk, you know, do some gardening. I don't know. But that's their problems, and really, it's none of my problem. And there is criticism in the room, and I think you know, being a public figure, you need to be credible, and you need to take that criticism seriously. And how I do it, and I try to do it in my activism as well, I try to figure out who in the room is criticizing me, who would also show up to tell me that they liked something I did. And that is a criticism that's valuable. If there's someone who is able to say, man, Louisa, that was a really good job, that is a person I'm really interested in their opinion when it comes to stuff that I messed up on. And I think that's the same with politics. If you're a climate group and you're not able to stand behind that politician when it, you know, when it's election day, or when the time has come to say, actually, there's a good policy that we support, and there was a good bill that we really needed to get through, thank you so much. If you're not able to stand up at that point, I find that criticism and this, you know, rallying against someone, I don't find it really honest. And I would understand if political voices would then say, you know, guys, you know, in all fairness,
Yep.
you know, give me a break.
Yep.
And so I find that is in activism, you know, we try to reflect that. Would we show up if something goes, like, works out? And that is, by the way, also how you build credibility for your own movement, because these politicians will know, you know, if we then, you know, criticize, you know, we mean it. And we don't do it out of principle or so.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So activism is happening all the time. My inbox overflows with announcements about, we're going to do this thing, we're going to show up, and I don't write about most of it. And I know that is something that bothers you in particular. So I want to talk about it. I mean, why, I have my own thoughts, but why do you think it is that so much activism, which can be so powerful and so moving in terms of getting a lot of people out, doesn't get media coverage?
Yeah.
Give it to me. I can take it.
Okay, so I can't, obviously, Bill has to cover the US angle on this. I can only speak for German newspapers. And I would say in the last 5-6 years, we saw enormous progress and important developments in the media coverage in Germany when it comes to climate. When we started our activism, there were 2 climate editors in the entire country that I would trust with a good story. Now, in, I would say, every media outlet that I can think of, there's a very competent person that I would know, that I could reach out to. Do they always write what I like? No, that's not their job. But I would know there is a person in the room that would ask the right questions, and that would also hold the editors accountable to maybe say, hey, are we actually doing this right here, or are we getting lost? So in terms of quality, there has been huge improvements. Right now, we're seeing some of the worst flooding in Central Europe that we have seen in decades, maybe ever. And I can count on one hand how many reports have been mentioning the climate crisis on those historic floods, which are the 5th historic floods that we've seen in this country in this year, in Germany in this year alone. So I will say in a few years from now, we will have a chancellor who won't get to go do anything else but walking around in valleys, visiting those flood sites. You know, it's been 4 times this year that Scholz had to take on the boots again and go and see some places and, you know, say he's sorry. and then, I don't know, go back and not act for climate. What I'm saying is, am I frustrated with a lot of reporting, ignoring what is out there? Yes, but I do also see a quality that is new. We have an issue, and you mentioned the Stonehenge situation, Bill. We have an issue with I would say, probably a wider media world getting very, very weird about a specific kind of activism and providing, I would say, quite a disproportionate amount of platforms for some very small actions of some very few people, while I would say kind of sidelining a lot of big momentous activism that is happening. And I found the UK was quite an important example of that. We a few weeks ago, ahead of the election, we saw some of the biggest walks on nature that the UK has seen in a while. We saw, I think, 100,000 people in central London marching for nature, which I found so truly inspiring and amazing and bold, and people standing out there. Some very famous actress included, saying if we don't protect nature now, there won't be nature to protect in a few decades from now. And I saw it on social media and I was like, man, that is big. And for a while there wasn't a single big report on that on any media, whereas you would have every single media outlet on the country reporting on some soup throwing or color painting or whatever. And I would say that pushes activists to do even more of that specific action, even though everyone agrees it might not be the most strategic thing, but you find yourself in a position that you feel, if I do that, I will get covered, otherwise I will be ignored. And if we want to bring climate to the media, apparently we have to do that. So there is some very toxic dynamic around kinds of activism that produce more toxic kinds of activism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm a journalist, that's where I come from. And I'm pretty sure, I think there's little question that I've written more words about climate change than anyone else in the English language, which just goes to show that I'm, given the temperature of the planet, arguably the least successful writer of all time. But I think that journalists don't take movements seriously, and I think that's a big mistake, because they don't understand. Then they miss how change actually happens. They misunderstand the importance of the cumulative actions of lots and lots of this work to shift the zeitgeist. And the shift of which I believe I've just used a German, oh, I'm so happy for myself.
We all and Goethe, we thank you.
That's the prize in fights this big, is the shift in the zeitgeist. And it only happens, so let me just give you the historical, what I'm talking about. You know, there was a great global climate conference in Copenhagen in 2008 that we've now forgotten because it failed. It produced nothing, but it was supposed to produce huge climate action. And the reason it didn't produce climate action was because there wasn't really a movement at that time. Barack Obama could come back to America and pay no price for having failed, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama combined to fail at that conference, and nothing happened. In the intervening 6 years, we built a real climate movement, one small demonstration at a time around the country over and over again. Culminating, by the time we were ready to go, there were 400,000 people marching in New York before that event stuff. Barack Obama in the UN said, when people are in the streets, we have to, when they march, we have to pay attention. They couldn't come back from Paris without an agreement, and so they produced an agreement. Louisa and Greta and their colleagues produced a change in the zeitgeist in 2018 and 2019 that again required political response. But journalists in general are so interested in in who holds nominal power at any given moment, the set of politicians or whoever that are there, that they miss what's happening underneath that actually is producing, in the end, change. They just think activists are, I mean, when we get right down to it, journalists think activists are silly, and they'd rather talk to CEOs or governors or the people who seem to be at any given moment powerful, you know.
Well, I think it can also be challenging to understand when there is so much. What is the activation that is a big moment, and what is the one that is?
That's always. I mean, that's what journalism should be about. It's always. I mean, it's hard to figure out, you know, what's important in an election and things, but it doesn't stop people from covering it, you know, ad nauseum. I mean, they cover every single possible part of an election and pay very little attention to other kinds of politics. Our idea that politics and elections are equivalent, that they're the same thing, is one of the things that blinds people to how change, I think, actually happens. But elections are a part of it all, and in the 50 days before the biggest election of our lifetime, they're completely gripping and transfixing and all of that. But politics works also in other ways, and a truly important part of that is the way that movements shift zeitgeist, perception, possibility, that they open or close the windows through which we view the world. And journalists almost always miss that. The number of people who you know, ever perceive how that's going on are very small, because none of it's official. You know, there's no no one's in charge of it. It's a thing. You know, so it's I commiserate with the difficulty of covering it. And I'm glad that you try. Yes.
In hindsight, you can tell it was a big deal, but in the moment, it's very hard. So we're just about out of time, but there is one thing that I was hoping you'd both touch on just quickly, unfortunately, which is, you know, you represent an intergenerational mix of activism. So, like, can you just, again, because we are pretty much out of time, quickly touch on where there is space for more intergenerational work in activism, and, you know, or where you see it already happening?
I spent most of my life organizing with young people. It's fantastic. I started 350.org with 7 college kids. You know, we built this divestment campaign that was mostly college kids. They, you know, great Bay Staters like Varshini Prakash, who divested UMass Amherst, went on to found the Sunrise Movement and brought us the Green New Deal, and hence the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, unbelievable work. But, and then, of course, the kind of school strike movement and so on. But I did hear too many people my age say, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem. And if they really wanted to rub salt in the wounds, they would look at some young person and say, you give me hope. You know, that's not okay. It's not fair, but it's also not practical. Young people by themselves lack the structural power to make the change we need on the scale that's required in the short time that we have. Louisa may someday be Chancellor of Germany, but it's not going to be tomorrow. And, you know, it's not going to be in the time that we have to get this done. It's a prediction, actually. So I'm just saying. But that's why we started Third Act. I said to Luis, we were talking earlier today, I said, if you've reached the age where you have hair coming out your ears, then you have structural power coming out your ears too. There's 70 million people over the age of 60 in this country. We punch above our weight because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. We have most of the financial assets. We're able to do, and so the great honor is to get to back up young people. We did the very first of these bank demonstrations here in Boston because the local Fridays for the Future chapter wanted to go after banks, but they, you know, I remember someone saying, we don't even have a checking account, so, you know, can you come help? And the very first demonstration that we did was we marched down to the Chase Bank at Downtown Crossing. There were a few hundred high school kids, because there's always high school kids. They know down the barrel they are staring. But at the back, and they're sprier, so they're at the lead. But in the back, there were a bunch of us from this nascent third act with a banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels," If nothing else, young people deserve the sense that they are not being abandoned to figure out somehow how to deal with what we've left behind. So,
Louisa, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I think Bill covered a whole lot of that, which is so important. I find, well, I would say some of the most transformative work that I did when I wasn't in the room. Like, the most important thing happened when I, did my speaking and organizing or whatever, and I would leave. And then people would start talking among each other, and families would start having those conversations, and friends would do that. And there was a kid asking their parents, like, "What do you do for work?" And the grandparents would ask their grandchildren, "So what do you do for life?" What's all these questions that people are having then. And I find again and again and again that activism is about translating those stories into every generation, every identity, and I found that some of the most convincing work is done by friends among each other, because they will tell those stories that are appealing. And we found that as young people, we are so, like as Bill said, we are so reliant on every generation, because this whole bull stuff about you're going to fix it when we are gone, please. We all know how old you're going to get, right? People are going to stay in power for a long time, and we have little time. So we will need people from every generation to provide that very convincing and very authentic story about why this certain generation has a say in this and should stand up and get stuff done. And I can't tell these stories by myself. I can tell a story from my generation, but I will need allies from every other generation to tell that story. And we know that when we talk about climate, we never just talk about climate. We talk about our lives, our culture, our identity. When I spoke to my late dad, about climate, and he would have the little Wurstbrötchen in the morning and his coffee and dream of his big Benz cars and so on, I wouldn't get very far with this whole climate story. I would get a bit further with this whole "Dad, do you love me" story. But I learned very early on that I can, speak endlessly about climate, but for someone who considers meat, cigarettes, cars, and big long holidays at that one thing that you finally reached and worked for and that you deserve, we need better stories and better dreams and new things to work for and long for and new wishes up on the horizon. And someone will have to get creative about this. And how ignorant would it be to imagine that creativity and those stories can come from a single generation? That's not working out. And I find that beautiful, because it does mean it's not just that everyone is affected by some climate crisis, but that also we need everyone to have a say in this. And that I find, is, if anything, quite democratic. Yeah.
That is a wonderful note for us to end on. That is all the time we have for this evening. But Louisa and Bill, thank you both so much for being here. And thanks to the American Council on Germany and the Goethe-Institut for hosting this. It's been a real pleasure. So we are going to turn this to you all now for a little bit to hear some questions, comments, thoughts. I believe there's a microphone somewhere that will be circulating.
Thank you. So one topic that neither of you touched on, which I feel is very important in terms of influencing the public, whether there's election or not, is the role of the academic community in being negligent in dealing effectively with the climate change crisis. Particularly economists, on the whole, with slight oversimplification, they're terrible, period. And I don't know if anyone in this room could name an economist that routinely argues for using no more fossil fuel. I mean, take Paul Krugman or any of these people. They claim they're, against climate change accelerating, but they don't do a thing about it. And so I deal with academics in Germany too, because I live in Berlin part of the year, as well as the US, and I often write critiques of the economic articles that appear in the professional journals, and like IPCC reports, which are garbage, okay, on the economic side. The science is okay, but on the economic side, they're terrible. And so how do you see, academics as people that the journalists and others and politicians listen to that are telling the wrong stories?
The economics profession has a very poor history here, and it began very early on when Bill Nordhaus published a series of papers that said we didn't need to take climate action, it wouldn't be essentially be economic and so on. And their cramped view of the world has been proved wrong by now, and I think that what's starting to really, I think that, look, if you didn't care about anything else, if you didn't care about nature or people or whatever else, in just sheer economic terms, this is the most unwise thing we've ever done. I think the place where that's finally breaking through now, and I think you're beginning to actually see it reflected even in professional economic discourse, is the fact that our that insurance is breaking down. Insurance is the actuarial table is one of the 2 or 3 most important human technologies there ever was. If you can't hedge risk, then nothing happens. No one will build a house, start a business, whatever. And the actuarial table was such a brilliant invention to allow that to happen. Its only flaw is that it depends on the Earth working in the future more or less as it worked in the past. And now that that's been deeply called into question, the entire underlying kind of premise of how we do economic thinking is the level of friction now imposed on economic systems is enormous. That said, the other thing that's happening now that's transformative and fascinating, and the fact on the ground that's sort of most crucial along with the rapid rise in temperature, is the incredibly dramatic fall in the price of renewable energy. Down 90% in the last decade. I wrote a piece, and I do a newsletter which now has a very wide circulation because it's free. That's my economic analysis. Today's I wrote about the fact that across much of the developing world in the last 6 months, there's been this just unseen, silent explosion in the in businesses and people putting up solar panels. Pakistan in the last 6 months people have, without any official government statistics, people have put up 13 gigawatts worth of solar panels. The entire electric grid in Pakistan is 46 gigawatts. So they've put up the equivalent of 30% of their electric grid in 6 months, just buying cheap Chinese solar panels and putting them on the roofs of businesses and things. So sort of around the, around all the official explanations of what's happening and things, there's a lot of really impressive movement going on. My guess is that the economics profession will miss most of it, and that it'll be the interesting job for the economic historians to tell us what happened in afterwards, is I think, and our job to keep trying to create the conditions that allow this to happen as easily as possible in as many places as possible.
Thanks for that question.
I just want to, it's sort of a question / comment, and mainly aimed at, yeah, how's that? Yeah.
Nice.
As far as journalistic coverage of the economy and global warming, I agree with what you said. There isn't enough. But a lot of really successful and effective leaders, is that better? Have always said about anything, if you want to get anything started or any movement started, start locally. And I always kind of, well, is that really true? Is that really true? Could that really work? There's a lot of local organizations such as Mass Peace Action or Cape Cod Climate Collaborative that have newsletters, and they're looking for articles. They're looking for people to write what they know and write events that are happening. And so that might be, do you think that would be a better, more effective way to get the word out, especially since these organizations are asking for volunteers? So people feel like, oh, there's something I can really do. There's actually, because a lot of people don't know what to do. Is there something I can do? And then they get the word out.
Yes. That's really good. I mean, it's maybe just a thought on the local and the global. It's always everything, right? If you're not rooted locally, it's quite hard to work sustainably as a movement. If you don't root yourself in some kind of wider context, may that be regional, national, or global, it's easy to get to forget that there's a world out there that we are connected to, and we as movement people know that everyone is watching everyone, and if people are not, visible out there, they will disengage and disencourage others. But the moment you see someone out there doing something that you care about, man, that's so inspiring, that is so important. You might have heard that some of the, we had a big campaign against some coal company in Germany where we had some interesting struggles around a village called Lützerath that was supposed to be destructed by a coal company, and that was in central Germany in 2022, quite unimaginable that by that time you could still destruct an entire village for a coal mine that provides coal that we don't even need. And some of the most powerful, or like what was so incredibly hopeful for the activists to spend day and night in that rainy, windy, cold treehouse setting, fighting everyone and everything, some of the most important things or messages for them came from Japan, where pictures of that very struggle were seen on the metro lines in Japan, and our Japanese friends sent them over saying, people here are looking at that happening right now. Some month later, I found out that in Georgia, in very Eastern Europe, right next to the big parliament of Tiflis, you would have a photo gallery portraying that very struggle of Lützerath. And just last month, I went to Paris and saw that there was a big architectural exhibition where they had in enormous amount of detailed work set up this entire scenery around that Lützerath thing. And I also sent it back to the activists. What I'm saying is, you need, every struggle at some point is local, because, the world is just an accumulation of locals, right? We're all local somewhere. But there's a wider world that is watching more closely than ever. And that is what movement work is around. And in terms of the media, what we have started really doing, and that, social media is bringing so much dismay about the world, but if there's one thing that is really promising is that we are not dependent anymore, on that one local journalist that might cover our action or not, but that we are so powerful right now in telling our own stories on all different platforms. So if you can contribute to that, I think it's wonderful.
Absolutely. Good organizing provides sometimes the transmission gear to take things from a local to a national and a global scale too. They don't call it global warming for nothing, making Cambridge the absolute perfect net zero doesn't do much if you're not also, so that's why we set up things like, say, Third Act. Third Act Massachusetts is fantastic. I was meeting with a bunch of their leaders yesterday. They're doing amazing things on Beacon Hill, but we also have it set up so that a couple of times a year when we need that action on for big national or global things, we know how to call on everybody and move through. And that's what good organizing looks like. It's hard to make that kind of thing happen. It's easier to have a million small things that never add up to more than the sum of their parts. But you've got to have it add up to more than the sum of its parts sometimes in order to make since the American, the unbendable American impulse is towards individualism, then the most important thing in this fight that people can do is figure out how to be a little less of an individual. We're not going to solve this one Tesla at a time or even one neighborhood at a time, okay? You have to figure out how to join together with others in movements large enough to change the basic ground rules some. That's why we set up organizations and try to, but what Louise is describing is just so beautiful when things catch on around the world. And the few times I've gotten to watch it, it's really exciting and powerful.
I also think there's a change in the journalism landscape too. You know, when the Boston Globe launched its climate change coverage officially like 3 years ago, they had never had a climate change reporter. Now we have 3. But the idea of a regional newspaper to have a dedicated climate desk was actually a pretty big deal. Like I came from Inside Climate News, where we were for a long time the only real dedicated climate change newsroom, and that wasn't that long ago. And now all of a sudden you have not just powerhouses like the New York Times and the Washington Post that have huge bureaus, but you have smaller regional papers like the Globe and smaller papers that are much smaller than us who are also telling the story as a beat journalist of what does climate change mean locally, what's our politics, what are our policies, what does the transition look like. So that's a big change too, I would say.
Thank you. I have a question about youth. Since Fridays for Future started out as a youth movement, rightly so, I think many of us received quite a cold shower at the last European elections and the regional elections in Germany. So to me it looks as if something went wrong. So what went wrong, if it did?
You mean, you speak of youth voter? Yes, we talked about that earlier, that we are seeing, especially now in our last election in Thuringia or something, that place that was very prominently a beautiful place, beautiful woods, beautiful people, and also kind of difficult history, which was the first region in Germany where Hitler won the first of his elections. Very important example, I find, how you can democratically vote someone who will take down democracy. And we saw that 38% of first-time voters in that election voted for a fascist party, not a right-wing party, a officially declared fascist, right extremist party. In that area, we have the most right extremist politician of all in Germany, who has by court decision got the label as being a fascist. We saw no one there hiding behind anything, but out and proudly presenting their right extremist ideologies. And we saw 38% of 18 until 24 years old people voting for that guy with his party. That is, of course, a disaster, and it raises very serious questions. 3 observations. I always thought that this idea that the younger generation would come and then magically fix something is a bit of an old story, because effectively what older generations do is provide infrastructure in a society for young people to grow into, for them to take it over. That's the whole purpose of that. So you let us grow into a very certain world, and you educate us with a very specific understanding of the world, and then you're surprised that this is working out and we're taking things over and we're not the magic new generation that does everything right. That's a bit self-serving, I find. So I remember the time when we started the Fridays for Future in Germany, and people were so confused that I had been flying before. And I'm like, wait, didn't you create this very specific world where you would tell us, go out, learn the languages, travel the world. If you didn't do this kind of internship abroad, you have no chance of getting a job in our world. And then we did all that. And then at some point we said, well, we kind of have questions now. Everyone was confused and shocked and, called us hypocrites because we lived into a world that was created by someone else. So I think there is some magic dreaming happening about the power of new generations coming up, while there's more and more effort being put in, raising generations in a very specific understanding of the world. Which I find is quite visible in the US, by the way. If I speak to students here now, they say they're so scared to do protesting on campus because of all the rules. And I would imagine those people setting up those very rules, will get together at some point kind of moaning about the students not getting involved at all. I'm like, yeah, well, what world are you creating? So there's magic thinking about generational change that won't just fall from heaven, but that needs organizing. Then there is also, secondly, there is some magic thinking about young generations being the green generation. And it came up when we started organizing. They would consider us to be the young green climate generation. And as young people, we are more aware of climate, and we worked hard to do that, but we were never that one generation with that one label and that one face. We were always pretty divided. We used to be, in Germany in particular, divided between kind of green votings, if you wanted to do it on polling, there were the green-leaning and the liberal-leaning people. And for everyone in the room who isn't so familiar with German politics, liberal in Germany is quite right-leaning. It's much more conservative than you would think. So we were divided among, those party lines all the way. And what we had in common is we want to change. It was just that we disagreed on where the change would be coming from. Would it come from green politics, or would it come from conservative and whatever technology and so on? So this division we see is still quite visible. It's just that now the division is, starkly across the democratic spectrum as well. So young people still want change, are longing for something else. It's just that some of us see it in the future and some of us see that change in the past. And that, I find, is a terrible story, but it's not as hopeless as you would see, because there is still things that we largely agree on. And then thirdly, I would think there is a tendency to look at young people in that very moment that you need them, for instance, to deliver on an election day. There's quite a tendency to ignore a lot of what is going wrong for young people on all other days of the year. And I do find, I'm concerned about young people's voting behavior, but most of all, I'm very concerned that so many young people have lost complete faith in governments, in the world, in their own future. And that shouldn't just concern us when it's time to go and vote. That should concern all of us all the time, because it matters for that very future. And at some point, those people will be in many positions, and those people deserve a perspective that is hopeful, and they deserve a system that is serving them, and they deserve a world where they aren't just guests in the waiting room waiting to be an adult and be there for the real party. But if we take human rights, children's rights seriously, I think we should abandon this idea of a waiting room for young people waiting to be old enough to be a real part of that world. But it should be a world that is serving them as well, and that is making sure that they have a feeling they're a real part of that, with whatever they can bring and whatever they need. And so, if anything, from these voting results, I think we should take some very productive and constructive anger about young people being abandoned in many ways. We should take some energy and enthusiasm from it to mobilize across generations. And we should maybe get rid of some wishful thinking when it comes to magic change, because as Bill has rightly pointed out, change is not falling from heaven. Change is something you organize for. And that means looking closely on how that organizing can happen best.
All right, maybe one more question?
Hi. Just to follow on from those comments, a couple of issues to do with the political process. There are 240 million registered voters in this country. And in 2020, the last federal election, a third of them did not vote. That's 80 million voters. And there's a disproportionate number of young people in that group. So surely, it's difficult, to think that things wouldn't be different if 90% of people or 95% of people voted. These are not people who still have to register. These are registered voters. They have to come out on the day and vote. So that's, and related to that is the second thing. We have this obsolete winner-takes-all system. And surely we need to spend time advocating in some better way for proportional representation. I think they have some of this in Germany, certainly in European countries. And again, if we had that kind of system, surely we would elect to office more people who have climate change front and center.
So yeah, work hard to get ranked choice voting passed, but don't work hard over the next 50 days to get it passed. Over the next 50 days, go do something about people not voting. It's, you know, I mean, like literally, like, go home and get to work. Sign up on that third act thing out there on the thing, and we can, you know, as I say, people are producing 200,000 postcards a day, a week into the swing states just from third act, aimed precisely at what we call low propensity voters, people who we think will vote the right way if they vote, but they're unlikely to vote. And the data shows that getting a handwritten postcard from someone increases by 2 or 3% the chance that they might actually do it. There are no magic solutions to anything. It's all work to make it happen, and so we should probably stop and go to work. And it's good.
All right, you heard it from Bill.
What a wonderful end of this discussion. Thank you to all. Luisa Neubauer, Sabrina Schenkman, and Bill, thank you for being with us tonight. I just want to mention again, stay with us, have a little glass of wine. And I learned that there is a list outside on a table. If you don't want to listen or talk and you want to act, you can subscribe for Third Act. That's what you told me, and please do that if you want to do that.
And if I could just quickly add, if there's something, we talked about the state that I can't really pronounce here, mess. So if you know, for all the local groups and something, if people feel like I want to get to do something, there's a third act. There's many things, the newsletter that people should read, Bill's newsletter really. And there's one very specific action to do next, the upcoming Friday, Friday the 20th. Help me out, State House? Outside the State House, because it's a global day of action. We talked about the local and the global, and right now, as the world is watching very closely, people across the world are kind of wondering where the activists, where the people doing, like, being out there, whatever. And that's a great moment because international media will look at that day, and we are making sure that there's a moment in Boston, there's going to be a beautiful banner and people get the chance to network, to be there. It's at noon, so you can use your lunch break or whatever, bring a friend, bring a sign if you want to, and let's make sure that we join this global day of people really around the world demanding that something happens. There is some action happening in New York, and we make sure we get some great stuff done in Boston. So it's Friday the 20th at noon at the State House.
So, I think you got it. Stay with us. Thanks for coming. Come back to the Goethe-Institut. Thanks to our panelists and the moderator.